Welcome to the Misinformation Nation podcast. I'm Christopher Dodd in Poland, where the people here have opened their borders, their towns, and their homes to the people escaping the ongoing war in neighboring Ukraine. This is a fantastic example of human solidarity, but it contrasts with the treatment of victims of other wars who escape to the West as refugees, only to be placed or forced into refugee camps or imprisonment, and subjected to beatings, or have rickety boats on which many arrive turned back to possibly sink in the open seas. Today, we take a look at the part the media plays in the way we have welcomed some with open arms and left others for dead. In episode 3, I Feel Like a Refugee. So while watching the news coverage of the recent refugee crisis in Ukraine, I saw a woman who had safely reached the Polish border. She was being interviewed by the BBC. She held a child in one hand and a suitcase in the other. And she told the journalist, "I feel like a refugee." So why did she say she feels like a refugee? That's the story we're going to talk about today. The story of the coverage of the crisis in Ukraine, especially the way that it's created a refugee crisis. So talking about the media coverage of these crises, we'll start in Poland, where the 24-hour news station has been giving constant coverage of the war, almost a blow-by-blow account. We even had one news report where a journalist went inside the apartment where one side of the wall had been blown out. And he interviewed their distraught family, the family that used to live there. So Poland is getting the war in their living room. That's a big difference in the way that we can normally cover wars. And the result of that, perhaps, is the way that Poland has welcomed refugees into their country and into their homes. There's been an acceptance of most of the over 1 million refugees that have passed through the Polish-Ukraine border in the first couple of weeks of the war. That's a change because Poland once said, this according to one minister, that we have to defend ourselves against refugees. He was referring to refugees from the Middle East. As one minister said, when there is a further refugee crisis in 2021, just 6 months before the current crisis, he said, these refugees, these Middle Eastern refugees from Afghanistan, Iraq, or Syria, might be carrying disease. Let's look at this double standard and the part that the media plays in it. So back in 2015, as you may remember, 6 million people fled the war in Syria. Most went to Turkey. They took most of the burden. It's just across the border. That makes perfect sense, just like the situation between Ukraine and Poland. The war is just next door. Everybody can see it, understand it, and wants to help. And the news coverage has played an important part of that. As I said, the people in Poland are interested in what's happening over their border in Ukraine. How does that affect the global audience? Let's go to the coverage of the war in Canada, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation.
The most vulnerable struggle to hurry under stress, with Ukrainian soldiers unable to stop the mortars, helping people get out if they can. But as some try to make it across an exposed road, civilians clearly visible.
Shit! Shit, 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 shit.
This is Ukraine. Hemorrhaging. And it's impossible to look away. Its western borders now home to a relentless flow of heartache as families part ways. The women and children traveling on, hopefully to safety, and the men back to a war many in a watching world fear they cannot win. Those who make it this far come carrying tales of horror. Victoria Honcharenko is from Kharkiv, on the other side of the country. There is no Kharkiv anymore, she says, only dead bodies on the streets.
So the war in your living room is now in North America, and the plight of the victims is the focus. That's quite a difference from the way that refugees have been dehumanized. And the best example of this is in the UK press. If you were to go to your Google search and look for tabloid press refugees 2015, you'd get an assortment of headlines that look something like this. The scourge on our shores. Migrants swarm, calling the army to hold the migrants tight. Now, if you confine your search to 2022, you'd get something like this. UK urged to help refugees, save them. Britain's refugee system in crisis. Just to put that into context, that system is the system that was put in by the ruling Conservative Party after the Brexit vote. The Brexit referendum was won by the Leave side on the back of reducing immigration as the main policy, which may have been unrelated to the 2015 refugee crisis, but that was certainly used. And it was mainly used by one of the leaders of the Brexit campaign, right-wing British politician and now pundit Nigel Farage. And Nigel Farage seems to have changed his tune.
I have to say, for my mind, there is a very, very big difference between what I've talked about so much over the last 2 years, namely these undocumented young males coming across the English Channel, who I do not believe qualify as refugees, and what is happening in Ukraine. These genuinely are refugees, and if you believe some reports from the European Union, they say up to 5 million could flee Ukraine's borders if this war continues.
So what has changed? Well, media coverage brings the war to our living rooms, as I said. The victims seem now more humanized. We don't call them names like Swarm or Tide. There's more of a focus on them, in fact. The way that they had to live, the way that they have to leave, those blown out apartments, for example. We don't focus on their effect on us. We focus on how they are now homeless, face death. And we've got an idea from this war coming home to us that, well, war is hell. Who knew? But sticking with the global media coverage of these crises, I want to talk more about this idea of proximity, because proximity and similarity is the word that was used by members of the Polish government to explain why they are handling this situation differently than others. Those were some very uncomfortable questions, by the way. Proximity and similarity is the answer. But is that proximity always physical, as we talked about before? How is the war being brought home farther afield? Here's a medley of how the flight of the Ukrainian people from their suddenly war-torn homeland is being covered around the world.
But this isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen.
Now the unthinkable has happened to them. And this is not a developing third world nation. This is Europe.
And what's compelling is just looking at them, the way they're dressed. These are prosperous, I'm loath to use the expression, these are prosperous middle-class people. These are not obviously refugees trying to get away from areas in the Middle East that are still in a big state of war. These are not people trying to get away from areas in North Africa. They look like any European family that you would live next door to.
Oh. Looks like we're talking now about a different type of proximity. The first voice you heard, for example, there was Charlie DeGatta of CBS News in the United States. For what he said, he issued this apology.
I spoke in a way that I regret, and for that, I'm sorry. What I'd hoped to convey is that what's unique about the fighting underway here is that this country has not really seen the scale of war in recent years, unlike some conflicts in countries I've covered that have tragically suffered through many years of fighting. You should never compare conflicts anyway. Each one is unique. I've dedicated much of my career to telling the story of suffering through any of these wars, wherever they may be. I used a poor choice of words, and I apologize for any offense I may have caused.
Badly worded? Well, let's take a look at his words and some of the others we heard in that medley. Middle class, European, not third world, prosperous, a family that would live next door to you. All these words describe the way we should look at these people. Take a look at the Syrian crisis, and we have those words used to dehumanize people. But is that really true? Or is that also a double standard? For example, most of the people who reached the shores of Europe all the way from Syria were also middle class. I mean, they paid thousands of dollars to smugglers, amongst others, to get them here. Damascus in Syria, one of the oldest cities in the world, is just as developed as Kiev. And Lina Nieri, whose autobiographical book about the refugee experience called The Ungrateful Refugee, describes herself as middle class. Her father was a dentist, her mother was a doctor, and yet we were constantly told that those people are different to us. Consider, for example, the colonial era word civilized. If Europeans are civilized, what are these Middle Eastern victims of war? So if you still think that the problem here is the wording, then this Ukrainian official who was interviewed by the BBC, David Sakvaritse, spells it out a little more clearly for you.
I'm sorry, it's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, children being killed every day with Putin's missiles.
There it is. Well, almost. Because nobody actually comes out and says it out loud, but we can still hear it in the subtext, or maybe niggling in our own subconscious. Refugees are brown, or Muslim. So these Ukrainians can't really be refugees, or maybe they're a different kind of refugee, or paradoxically, perhaps Ukrainians are the real refugees, more worthy of our attention, and sympathy, and intervention, so that we can now jumpstart the policies and conventions on asylum that were originally intended for all such humanitarian causes. Now, an optimistic person could say that this is all good, that this refugee story, as horrible as it is, has shown us the horridness of war, and it's made us more willing to jump in and help people in need when they need it. It's taught us that these people are no different from us, that this could happen to any of us, and we are not different. It's not from our own brilliant foresight that we happen to be from countries who are free from war. But that's one way to look at it. Another possibility is that next time, because the war might be a little farther away, when the ravages are not so plain to see, and the victims have a different religion or skin color than the people who present the news, everything we've learned from this crisis will be forgotten, deja vu all over again. And then the media machine, which drives public opinion, or is it the other way around, chicken or the egg? I don't know. They will point to the hordes, the masses, or the scourge on our shores once again. I fear that that would prove that what I now suspect had been true all along, that all refugees are equal, but some are more equal than others. I'm Christopher Dodd. That's episode 3, I Feel Like a Refugee. And if you're stopping by for the first time, go back and listen to previous episodes and let us know what you think. You can also check out our website at misinformation.nation.com. I'm Christopher Dodd. Music is by Cyril. Thanks for listening. I'll see you soon.